Good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to welcome you on behalf of the Center for European Studies, where I have just taken over. This is our second event of the semester. I'm thrilled today to be hosting our panelists, about whom I'll say something in a minute. But first, I want to thank the Center for Middle Eastern Studies and the South Asia Studies Program for co-sponsoring the event and for the great support from the institution as well for it. There's been a lot of interest in what's going on in Afghanistan. I also want to thank our panelists who basically kind of endured my immediate scramble to try to get this together, because I thought it was very important that we have a serious conversation today. And I'll introduce everyone first, and then I'll say a couple of things about Afghanistan myself, because I'm also working on some of this, and I want to contextualize what we'll be hearing. So we're particularly lucky to have Shah Mahmood Hanifi here with us today. He is, in my view, one of the most serious scholars around and is doing extraordinary work in Afghanistan, which is much needed. He is professor of history at James Madison University, where he teaches courses in the Middle East and South Asia. His first book was Connecting Histories in Afghanistan. His research and publications have addressed subjects including colonial political economy, the history of printing, the Pashto language, photography, cartography, animal and environmental studies, and Orientalism in Afghanistan. His recent edited book, from which I have learned a lot, I have to say, which I've been reading for, sort of intensely and repeatedly, is on Mount Stuart Elphinstone. And he is now working on a monograph that examines the environmental history of Afghanistan over the longue durée through water, wood, animals, and food. And I should say that we're hoping to have him back to speak about this, because I think that it's an extraordinarily important topic. And I know that it's very dear to Shah Mahmood as well, but we also don't hear nearly enough about the environment in a context like Afghanistan's. We also don't hear about Afghanistan's deep history, but I'll say more about that in a second. Phivos Semyonidis is a researcher and human rights activist from Athens, Greece. He is an MA graduate from the Center for Research Architecture and the acting director of Disinfo Collective, and his work focuses on the far/alt-right online, militarized border regimes, and human rights violations in the external borders of the EU. I should add that I met Phivos when I was in Greece in 2016. I had gone back to my island, which is one of my homes, Lesbos, to see how the people in my village, the village which I consider my home, Olivos, were holding up, because I had been there also in 2015 in the summer. And I was given his phone number, actually, by a friend of mine who was working with the refugees and who told me that Phivos had been working with Plathanos, one of the refugee reception groups in Lesbos. And we met, and it's been an education for me, I have to say. Phivos has invariably introduced me to not only fascinating people, Hobaka is one of them, and we'll talk about her in a second, but he's also managed to teach me things about what activists have done and can do, both conceptually and organizationally. He took me to the Notara 26 squat in Athens and Exarchia in 2016. But he also managed to get me into the Moria camp, which was burned down recently. And I was told that there was no way I could get in. And of course, Phivos arranged it, as Phivos is wont to do. So, but I also admire him tremendously for his intellectual and organizational capacities. Hobaka, whom I'm meeting for the first time, and is the senior, but whose work is fascinating, is the senior policy analyst for the Border Violence Monitoring Network. She holds an MSc in International Social and Public Policy from the London School of Economics, where her final thesis focused on the criminalization of movement through a case study of pushbacks over the Evros River border between Greece and Turkey. Hope has been working in the field with people on the move in Greece since 2018, involved in both grassroots direct aid structures, as well as engaging in advocacy work and publishing analytical publications in EU migration policy. I have to say that we will be putting up this recording online in Ideas and Futures, which is a public-facing outlet that I work with. But one of the things that we're hoping to put up there also is links to everybody's work. And I think that the work that Hope is doing on pushbacks is extraordinarily important. And I hope that you will look it up. And if you have a link, maybe you can even put it in chat, Hope, so that people can look at it now. But both of them will be showing images. I want to say very quickly that before I hand it over to Shah Mahmood, I think what's so extraordinary about Afghanistan is how little we know about it in some very profound sense, and how utterly and I don't, obviously not Shah Mahmood, but how little we, who are basically products of mediatization and the relationship between mediatization and war in our current moment, know about Afghanistan, and how utterly, when you start tracking the history that Shah Mahmood has done such a wonderful job of beginning to lay out, and some of his fellow scholars like Robert Cruz and Benjamin Hopkins and Nivi Manchandana, you'll see though that that so much of the language of how we think about Afghanistan is coming straight out of colonial documents, right? So I'm reading Elphinstone, it's all there. This notion of tribe, of clan, of Pashto, of language, of culture, right? And about which Shah Mahmood will be speaking more. In my own research, what I'm also finding and writing about, and I'll be talking more about this on October 21st, is that one of the transitional moments is also when in the late 19th century, when Curzon is Viceroy of India, but even as he's on his way to becoming Viceroy of India, he's obsessed with Russia, right? So he writes Russia and Central Asia in 1889 and the Anglo-Russian question. But he is also, as he proudly boasts in his text on the frontiers, one of the person who oversees the carving out of what comes to be called the Northwest Frontier Province in Pakistan, which is now, part of the border zone, which constitutes what has come to be called atrociously AFBAC, which is really just a war construction. And his obsession with Russia, of course, leads to him also proposing after World War I the division of the border between Poland and the Soviet Union, and which comes to be known as the Trans-Curzon line, that is actually adopted at Yalta. And in fact, Stalin says then, when the British are arguing with him about the line that Stalin wants, that are you, I mean, at least he's supposed to have said that, are you asking me to tell the British, the Russian people that I am less Russian than Curzon, right? So in some sense, Curzon's obsession with Russia and protecting the Indian colonies, right? Because India remains the jewel in the crown because of it, for whatever reasons, which is the obsession with the buffer state. And to me, what's so striking about this, all of the reading I've been doing recently for this other project that I'm doing, is how much this notion of Afghanistan as a buffer state is adopted not just by the Americans, but also by the Pakistani state, right? So this idea that it's always a space that some state formation, which is not Afghan, right, is deploying in some sense, or is eager to control in order to protect its own borders, but also its own notion of whatever the spoils within its own state are, right? And so tribe, clan, and buffer, right? I mean, and then of course, what's at stake is, as always, the capitalist economy, because Curzon is also writing about the Trans-Caspian Railway, but of course we know that there's all kinds of oil and so on concerns subsequently as well, right? So there's a Cold War element, there's oil, there's the railway, there's the protection of the colonies. So I just wanted to frame that a little bit. Shamamutu will talk more, and we'll have much wiser and deeper things to say. And so I'm going to turn it over. Thank you so much for being here.
Well, Sadia, thank you for some very helpful initial framing and for your generous introduction. I'm really truly grateful to be here and to be working with kind of hands-on activists rather than merely just scholars. It's a great pleasure. I apologize, first of all. My office has a lawnmower happening now outside, and I'm not updated so as to get Zoom on my computer. So I apologize for, I don't mean to be looking or speaking down to you if that's the projection I'm giving at all here. I'm happy to be with you. Let me begin by saying, in my view, knowledge about Afghanistan has really been used against the people there more than as a liberating potential for the people there. And this has a lot of locations and a lot of structures, but just very quickly, I want to mention the role or lack thereof, more precisely, of history in a sort of national curriculum in Afghanistan. That is, the leaders of Afghanistan do not maximize the potential kind of integrative function that history can serve at this critical moment when we may be witnessing, indeed, the disappearance of Afghanistan as a unit of geography and political economy. So in broad measure, I think we can talk in more detail about the precise elements of the colonial discursive functioning of functioning and structuring of the discourse of Afghanistan. But I thought what I would do is lay out a little more broadly some of the, I guess, heritage of colonial and imperial discursive approaches to Afghanistan, more thematically rather than historically for the moment. And of course, we can return to more specific historical incidents or episodes or texts. But in general, let me begin with geography and say that it is the colonial and imperial era that really privileged Kabul, and the geographic privileging of certain locations at the expense of others is a primary feature of colonial discourse about Afghanistan. And we can kind of press this geographic privileging in a couple of directions. The first is a kind of inter-urban positioning. And in privileging Kabul, what we're missing is, of course, attention to other urban locations. That is Kandahar, Herat, and Mazar-e-Sharif most importantly. And it is the relationship between these cities that's often lost in the singular exclusive focus on Kabul, as if what happens in Kabul is reflective of the rest of the country. And I would just like to argue that Kabul is more exceptional than normative for Afghanistan as a whole. And in this sense, it's the rural zone. Colonial knowledge formations generally, particularly not just of Afghanistan, but of India, are not good with rural knowledge. And there is a conspicuous gap in rural knowledge in the current expression of imperial discourse about Afghanistan, and indeed in more sort of traditional colonial discourse about Afghanistan. And we can come back more to the, let's just say, the geographic dimensions of colonialism and imperialism in Afghanistan. I think the second issue that is worth noting is the salience of racism in colonial and imperial frameworks of seeing the world. And for Afghanistan, ethnicity has become that serviceable analytic unit. And indeed, it's quite rare to find any discussions about any aspect of Afghanistan that are not organized around ethnicity. And this usage of ethnicity becomes, in many ways, a racist construction, meaning exclusivity and connected to power hierarchies. And once again, we can get beneath this general theme by attention particularly to Pashtuns and Pashtun ethnicity as the primary explanatory matrix for all things Afghanistan. And we can immediately start to see some contradictions in colonial discourse, because on the one hand, Pashtuns are allegedly the most representative of the rural zone, where knowledge is thin, but they are used to explain an urban sociological formation. That is really the urban nature of the Afghan state, where problematically, Pashtun ethnicity is invoked as an explanatory variable. And there's no connection between urban and rural Pashtuns, and that renders the overall discourse between tribe and state in Afghanistan rather circular and hollow at once. By way of discursive contradictions that colonialism also generates for Afghanistan, is that we see two incompatible frames of reference. That is, one of a Pashtun dominated state, and the state politics in Afghanistan is often reduced to Pashtun ethnicity, as we just said. But simultaneously, Afghanistan is recognized as a weak state, indeed a failed state. And that is hard to bridge. A dominant state is a strong state that dominates society. And if that's what Pashtun domination is supposed to be all about, then how does it operate in a fractured, failed state context? Let's turn, of course, and maybe we can return in more specific terms to gender and the gender dimension of colonial and imperial discursive formations broadly, and in Afghanistan specifically, where again, the gendered lens is often, it has both an ethnic and a geographic scopic to it. And here we have this curious phenomena of essentially, for at least the American imperial experience, a great deal of emphasis on urban women, and urban Persian-speaking women are the vanguard of, democratic national development. Whereas in the rural zone, where Pashtun men are, they become the enemy. And then the overall practice of American imperialism in Afghanistan is organized around saving urban Persian-speaking women and eliminating, killing rural Pashtuns. And again, full of true impractical and delusions fantasies. And this speaks in some ways to the epistemological violence, which would be another theme here generally, of Afghanistan's position, American imperialism in particular. For example, in valorizing women and urban women in particular, what is missed is the historical prominence that the Soviet occupation of Afghanistan gave for women. And it's under the Soviets that we get the first glimmers of what appear to be kind of very, very liberal gender practices in the media and on TV and on the radio, where at the same time, the American covert support of the Mujahideen is laying the foundations for the kind of gendered violence that is associated with the Taliban today. And so perhaps we can return to that again. Let's then now turn to another theme. And here, I'd like to just call it experimentation. There has been a great deal of experimentation of military, of political, of judicial sorts associated with the war in Afghanistan. And this is reminiscent of earlier colonial experiences, particularly the British in India, where there's at least one strand of historiography that it's sort of an absent-mindedness, that colonialism just kind of wandered in there and just sort of experimented. And we have some of that gap really between what experimentation veils is that there is a decision-making process here. There are policymakers that are identifiable, and there are now, here is where we have a problem in Afghanistan, because so much of the formal activity is covert. We can't kind of follow the trail from policy to practice. And indeed, that gap between theory and practice, theory of elections and the practice of elections in Afghanistan, there's just such a wide gulf there. The theory of counterinsurgency versus the actual practice of counterinsurgency. And again, I say this in a comparative sense, that colonialism often sort of is a zone of experimentation where theories are developed that actually fail and need to be adjusted. And this becomes a perpetuating zone of experimentation, therefore. Again, very quickly, because I know we're running out of time. I'd like to turn to the commercial dimensions of colonialism and imperialism and the profiteering. And of course, the British East India Company being the kind of engine of British colonialism in South Asia is a corporation. It's a company. It's a profit obsessed machine. And the profiteering of the current recent war in Afghanistan by contractors, and that is private sort of security contractors at the lower level, Dynacor, Z Corporation, XE, Blackwater, formerly known as Blackwater, ironically known as Academy, and the big five industrial corporations. I mean, Boeing, Lockheed Martin, McDonnell Douglas, Raytheon, BAE Systems, just incredible scales of profiteering. And now, I guess to the more relevant aspects here of violence and mobility. And of course, colonialism carries with it all kinds of violence, epistemological and physical. And the kind of levels of physical violence in Afghanistan are, I guess, incalculable when we consider the experimentation and pain rays and you know, whatever the mother of all bombs is an experimental, you know, sort of gradient just below a nuclear explosion. And of course, prisons, rendition, night raids, abductions, assassinations, torture, all speak to a real culture of violence here, the corporate culture of violence as well. Finally, mobility. Colonialism is historically predicated on forms of mobility from the metropole to the colony and back. And the Indian textile trade, British East India Company officials represent that kind of circulation, global circulation of commodities and human resources, human and material resources. At the same time, colonialism is about imposing new regimes of mobility on the colonized space. And here, perhaps the irony of the final stretch of American presence in Afghanistan, which involves just a small road to the airport, and the premium placed upon that small distance of mobility, where the irony is that basically from the perspective of the air surveillance, almost anything that moved in Afghanistan in the fall of 2001 was subject to incineration. And for the early years of the war, mobility was lethal. It's just almost unquantifiable, the number of wedding parties and labor parties that were exterminated from the air for just being mobile. Once again, the sort of demand that the Taliban allow certain forms of mobility, both local to the airport, and then of course, the wider circulation is predicated on very different kinds of regulations concerning mobility. And perhaps the final point here for thematic purposes is the lies that are the basis of so much of this imperial and colonial activity. At the very end of the United States presence, now it's known in the mass media here that the drone bombing of originally alleged imminent suicide bombers turns out to be an innocent family, including 7 children. And of course, now that's known, but it was known really minutes after the incident on the ground there. And so to come clean 2 weeks after claiming a mistake, it really speaks to the perpetuation. And there's a lot of good journalism by the journalists Ackerman and Whitlock that go through the continual series of lies that American spokesmen gave about the progress of the war, casualties and you know, other kinds of developments. So I guess that speaks to censorship and propaganda. There's a discursive regulation, and censorship and propaganda are another kind of gradient of about right untruths and lies. And so maybe I can just leave it with that discursive point and turn it over.
Unmute. Thank you so much, Mahmoud. And we will move on to Firoz. I should also point out that just to add a little bit of history here, is that as one of the things that Mahmoud has presented in his work also is the way in which Louis Dupre, the American, it sort of takes these British models and applies them to Afghanistan. But on the way, I think it's also very important to keep in mind that Afghanistan also becomes a point of discursive creation as A.T. Mahan is reimagining American imperial power at the turn of the century. So a lot of what Curzon is writing is both drawing upon, he's reading Frederick Jackson Turner about the frontier, right? And it's a very interesting reading of Jackson Turner, but it's also, I think, a response to Mahan as a kind of vision for what what the American imperium is going to look like, as opposed to the British imperium, right? So there's a kind of contestation, and that goes into World War I, where kind of you get a shift from Britain to the Wilsonian vision that then gets kind of, I think, kind of brought up through World War II and leads into the Cold War, right? So there's a kind of there's a large history there of a kind of contestation that turns into an imbrication that still has to be written, I think, very importantly. We're now going to move over to the refugees, to the refugee question in Europe. This is a Center for European Studies event, of course, so I tried not to exceed my purview. So I reached out to people dealing with the Afghan issue in Europe, where I should also say that back in 2010, when I became, or 2009, when I started thinking about migration to Greece through Lesbos, which became one of the frontline reception areas. Afghan refugees were young Afghan men were very much a part of the groups that were coming in, and I remember seeing them in the village as they came in through the ships, right? And then, of course, in 2015, this grew, but now we're going to turn it over to Phoebus, and he's going to tell you more. Thank you.
So thank you, everybody, for being here. Thank you, Sadia. Thank you, Shah Mahmoud. And I mean, if I have to be completely honest with you, I would really like to have a pause button for general time in the universe and just go through Shah Mahmoud's talk and then recalibrate mine. But I hope that we are going to actually talk about some of these things later on. I'm going to share my screen with you. So please bear with me for a second. This should work. And this should also present this. Yes, it does. Okay. So from the notion of the lie, I'm going to start with a myth. And we come in peace. This phrase here, I'm not choosing this as a title of my presentation, to represent the displaced communities, or I'm not trying to project what people on the move would say coming towards Europe or coming towards the US or Australia or anywhere else. I take this coming from Greek mouths or from the mouths of people that have been living in the same geography that I'm residing right now. And I would like to start with a myth of coming in peace, which strongly relates to Afghanistan in two occasions. Having grew up in Greece, having been part of the Greek educational system with all of its faults, maybe, the first time I encountered this coming in peace idea was on the myth and the history of Alexander the Great. And his expedition against Persia, allegedly the first united Greek expedition. We learned in school that Alexander the Great was a benevolent conqueror. He was not a dictator. He was not killing people. He somehow conquered everything with light of knowledge and scholar work. And the second time that I've heard of it was when I started wondering, what did Greece do in Afghanistan? And that was a question that troubled me a lot, even for today's presentation. And I once again realized that there's very few things that we know about the military involvement of Greek forces as part of ISAF and NATO in Afghanistan. Yet we always hear that we went there peacefully, we left there peacefully. And when I say we left, I mean just the troops, not the people that collaborated with the Greek forces, which unfortunately were not evacuated up to this day. So on my presentation, I'm going to focus mainly on what people will face once they arrive here on their journey to enter Greece. And I'm going to try to give you a notion of how this connects a bit with the EU policies, because Hope's intervention is going to give us way more information than I could ever do on that. So on this note, one of the first things that people have to understand is the question of choice. People are arriving here, and there is a whole discussion about Turkey being a safe third country, which again, Hope will touch upon a lot. But what was really interesting while I was, through my work, is that I figured there is indeed programs for refugees in Turkey. And I found this, which was one of the most recent papers that one could find, May 2021, EU facility for refugees in Turkey. And, you know, being curious, I just typed the words on the search of Syrian or Syria, and I got 59 results, which look something like this. You know, Syrian under temporary protection, the Syria crisis, Syrian women, Syrian populations. And then I typed in Afghan because I wanted a phrase that could keep, you know, the Afghans, the Afghan population, Afghanistan, something that would cover this. And this is what came up. And I think it's quite self-explanatory. There was no results. Yet people will arrive in Greece, but one of the main questions is, as what will they arrive? One of the documents that I and Sadia had the chance to receive and to read through back in 2016, right after the EU-Turkey deal, which basically and practically closed the borders from Greece to the rest of the European Union, spoke a lot about the dipole of good refugee, bad refugee. And this is something that we see along in the media. Yet there was a problem. I could find a very, very well explanatory and, you know, who is the bad refugee for Europe? If you come from Bangladesh, from Morocco, from Tunisia, Algeria, and other places, I mean, it says you have a low percentage of recognition and you're considered as being part of the economic profile. The next paragraph goes on and says refugee profile. And yet Afghanistan is in neither of those two. So where does Afghanistan fall under? And this is obviously just to see that there is a genealogy of trying to avoid dealing with the Afghanistan issue when it comes to the Greek and EU policies. Yet, as UNHCR says, and I mean, you know, data when it comes to arrivals are not necessarily, you know, very specific these days when it comes to Greece and the EU, but I think that the 45.3% of the population coming from Afghanistan, of the refugee population, says something that there is indeed populations coming, even for those that don't really want to acknowledge that. Interestingly enough, and let me move the, okay, sorry for that. Okay, so 10 days before the capture of Kabul, the official one, Greece participated in a statement together with other EU officials, when it basically spoke about the returns to Afghanistan. Afghanistan for years has been one of the most important countries of origin for the European Union. For example, since 2015, around 570,000 asylum applications were lodged by Afghan nationals in the EU. And it continues on the same page, saying that in 2020, Afghanistan was the second most important country of origin with around 44,000 first-time applications of asylum. This trend continues in 2021. We also note with concern the high proportion of unaccompanied minors among irregular Afghan arrivals. So basically, we are saying that there is people coming from Afghanistan. Some of them are unaccompanied minors, and this is, we even identify that as a trend that's been going on when it comes to the EU and Greek language. Yet on the next page, we say that, moreover, we would like to highlight the urgent need to perform returns, and that means deportations, both voluntary and non-voluntary, to Afghanistan, in view of the expected likelihood that Afghanistan will continue to be a significant source of irregular migration to the EU. We would like to underline the importance of returning those without genuine protection needs. Furthermore, stopping returns sends the wrong signal and is likely to motivate even more Afghan citizens to leave their home for the EU. And among the last lines, which I found most interesting, is finding ways to secure returns to Afghanistan should be a priority for all of us. If concrete offers to the Afghan government are needed, we should not hesitate to come up with proposals how to support Afghanistan in their fight against irregular migration and to stabilize the country. And I've highlighted the word stabilization here, stabilize, because it brings memories of readings that I have about counterinsurgency and the way of providing infrastructure. And it ties directly to what allegedly Greek forces were doing in Afghanistan as part of the ISAF and NATO. Allegedly, and that's how the myth goes, we never fought, we never engaged in combat. We merely provided infrastructure for the country that needed it. Again, this was 10 days before the capture of Kabul. And then 2 days after that, the same person, Notis Mitarakis, that signed the previous letter on behalf of Greece, now said this: we need a united approach, a common policy within the EU. We cannot be the gateway to Europe, and we will continue to implement a strict but fair migration policy. And while many things can be said, and it's not the point of my intervention today to speak about the asylum process, which definitely calls for a different event and different analysis, I'd like to show what people are to expect once they arrive here as part of this strict but fair migration policy. So we are going to take a look at what in the military, let's say, language is called theater. So we have the one in the north, which is Evros, here in blue, and that's the land border between Greece and Turkey. And then we have the islands in the eastern side of the Aegean, next to Turkey, which are, Lesbos is one of them, Chios, Leros, Kos, Samos, and also Rhodos. We are going to focus first on Evros. So, and I will change the orientation here just to make this, before we do that, these are the detention sites that are already active on Evros, are being used as they are, and these are all in the proximity of the river. The mapping was done by an amazing scholar here in Greece, Lena Karamanidou, and she kindly shared this online. So this shows the amount of detention sites and police stations, official or unofficial detention sites that people are usually detained to, sometimes prior to being pushed back. Now, you will see that this is not only a matter of detention sites, because people also have to face a wall, which is existing for years now. New parts of the wall on the south side of the river that are being erected right now with Greek and EU funds as a response to last year's events when allegedly there was some sort of an invasion, or at least that's how the media portrayed it, of asylum seekers trying to enter Greece. Frontex was kind enough to provide us with a Zeppelin, which has a radius of 32 kilometers in order to surveil the border area. And all this, of course, comes on top of a heavily militarized zone consisting of watchtowers, barracks, military patrols, police patrols, and Frontex. So how does it actually look like? What are the visuals of this? Well, in the beginning, this is a picture of the fence in Evros. There's a picture of a drone that's being used right now. You can see the troops that the Greek government is using and has used last year as well to prevent this alleged influx of people. And you also have watchtowers all around this border. Greece is not alone on that, obviously, as it also seeks to get help from EU institutions. So we can see here the Zeppelin, which is a newly acquired by Frontex. Interestingly enough, it's in its pilot phase, and then it will go to Northern Africa to continue its surveillance mission. We have thermal cameras. We have Frontex officers directly involved in guarding, and we also have non-Frontex EU forces that are coming to help Greece in combating illegal migration as their contracts and their policies very, very specifically dictate. Now let's move to the islands. Greece is implementing, once somebody reaches the Turkish coast, they're going to try to get on a boat and cross the border. And this is where you have the Hellenic Coast Guard with a very 24/7 presence there. Then you have Frontex vessels that are going to also surveil the same areas. And interestingly enough, you have also NATO participating in these exercises ever since 2016, also running surveillance missions with their vessels also being seen participating or monitoring alleged pushbacks in these waters. And if you manage to cross, what awaits you is the new multi-purpose reception and identification centers in these islands. And we're going to talk a bit about them in a minute. But so we see a very militarized border that consists of the Hellenic Coast Guard, the Frontex, and the NATO vessels, which usually turn people, apprehend people and leave them afloat into these structures as of last year, which are called life rafts, and by no means are designed to use for pushbacks. They are designed as life-saving equipment. But let's say you manage to go past that, you will end up in one of these places. And that is the new multi-purpose reception and identification center in Samos that opened up yesterday, and people are to move either today or tomorrow. What is interesting about this, and in terms of language, what caught my attention is, it's called a multi-purpose reception and identification center in European language, while in Greek language, the official name is closed controlled structures. And I'm sure that Hope is going to talk about it, about the policy sides of it. But it's really interesting for me to see how both sides are going to fund the same thing. They're going to call it something completely different. The next thing I'd like to talk a bit about is whose money comes into all that. And I think I will leave you with that, and I'm looking forward to discussions later on. So Greece has benefited for all this, and by all this I mean the European support through two basic funds that exist. The one is called the Asylum and Migration and Integration Fund, and the other is called the Internal Security Fund. And together with the emergency assistance that Greece has requested, it has benefited 3.54 billion euros. Interestingly enough, this does not include the national funds that Greece is spending, and also does not include the secret fund that Greece has officially set up and denies giving any information about. And I'm talking about the secret fund, which is, its documents are supposed to be destroyed every 6 months. We are going to have no information about how these funds are spent, for which purposes, and interestingly, even more enough, the supervision of this fund is going to be done by people related to the ministry that controls the very same fund. Last but not least, a very small point which just came in today. We learned that Greece, apart from its attempts to fund border militarization and securitization, also spends the quite significant amount of 73,000 euros plus some change in Afghanistan these past 3 days to actually launch an advertisement campaign to convince people not to come to Europe. Thank you all for being here. Thanks again to Sadia. Thanks to Saad Mahmoud. And I think that one of the main questions that I'd like to leave this with is, all this raises questions of complicitness, and it's about time that we start thinking of Greece not merely as a victim of its geography, but as a very willing and complicit partner into many of these policies and many of these actions and their embodiments and performances. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Firoz. That was just absolutely fascinating. And as always, I learned a lot. Hope, over to you.
Thank you. Thanks, Sadia, for the introduction. And thanks to Firoz and Shah Mahmoud for your very interesting talks. I'm also just going to share my screen. That's worked. Okay. Okay, so yeah, my name is Hope Barker, and I'm here today on behalf of the Border Violence. And I will kind of build off of Fivos's presentation, where he already touched lightly on some of the EU policies and how that's played into the Greek response, but I will speak more broadly to EU policies in relation to the current situation in Afghanistan, how those are unfolding on the ground, and how that links into the history of these kinds of situations. So I will kind of loosely divide that into two sections, but I will look at formal EU policy. So looking back to the last time this kind of situation happened, the 2015 so-called Syrian refugee crisis, and how that played out then. And also the very important concepts of safe country practices as they appear in EU legislation and how those feed into the EU response currently. with a particular look at the EU's commitment to externalizing responsibility for increased migration flows, and this process of externalization as an almost neo-colonialist outlook, taking the consequences of the issues ceded by the West in Afghanistan and contracting out the responsibility to neighboring states. And then I will go on to look at more informal EU policies, which is how people on the move experience the EU's border regime on the ground for those who make it to Europe, looking at pushbacks and other human rights violations along Balkan transit routes. So first of all, it's very important for us to look at safe country practices in EU legislation to better understand the EU's response to what's happening in Afghanistan currently. So the two main mechanisms that are used in the EU in the Common European Asylum System are safe countries of origin and safe third countries. So Fivos briefly touched on this with the kind of good refugee, bad migrant dichotomy. So you have the kind of bad migrants from safe countries of origin who fall into this economic migrant bracket. And these people are deemed as being from safe countries of origin. And this is where applications for international protection may be categorized as manifestly unfounded and therefore subject to accelerated procedures when the applicant's country of origin is deemed as safe in the state in which the application has been lodged. So indicative factors for this designation would include the number of refugees and recognition rates over the last few years, observance of human rights, democratic institutions, and stability. So how likely the situation is to change in that country. And the second concept we'll turn to is that of safe third countries. So these are non-EU states that are considered safe for an applicant of international protection to lodge their application, as the following criteria are cumulatively met. So this refers to life and liberty not being threatened because of race, religion, nationality, membership in a particular social group or political belief. The country in question adheres to the key principle of non-refoulement. There is no serious risk of damage to the applicant of international protection. It is possible to apply for refugee status and have that granted under the Geneva Convention, and the applicant has some link to that third country. So maybe it was the first country of asylum that they passed through and should have claimed asylum in. Maybe they're from a neighboring country. Maybe they're deemed as having cultural or linguistic links to that country. So this is of particular importance to remember when we get onto the idea of Turkey as a safe third country for Afghans. But first of all, we will turn to safe countries of origin. This is a mechanism that has prevailed across member states since the 1990s and was officially codified in the Common European Asylum System in 2005. But then in 2015, it kind of went through a revival. So obviously in 2015, the so-called Syrian refugee crisis began. And there was a kind of panic of EU member states to rush together and create some kind of operational plan to deal with the situation, very similar to what's happening now with the situation in Afghanistan. And one thing that they discussed was that in 2015, actually 55% of all asylum requests had resulted in negative decisions. And for some nationalities, almost all asylum requests were rejected. So the idea they came up with was to designate safe countries of origin that would be then in lists. And then for these countries, the processes could be accelerated. So those deserving of protection would be able to have streamlined applications and get the protection more quickly, was supposedly the idea. And this then led to the Commission's proposal for the Asylum Procedures Directive to become a regulation in 2016. And one key part of changing the directive to a regulation was to establish an EU common list of safe countries of origin that would harmonise procedural consequences of using the mechanism and would remove current discretion regarding whether or not to use it. And what the Commission put forward as a plan was that EASO would be the body that would gather this information and be responsible for the evidentiary assessment of whether third countries fulfill criteria for the designation. Despite two attempts to create a common list of safe countries of origin by EU member states, no common list was ever established, and this project never came to fruition and was eventually abandoned. So the state of play as it stands now is that we still have individual lists across different member states where different countries are deemed as safe in different states, and some states don't even use the mechanism at all. So as you can imagine, this leads to the reality on the ground that people on the move are having different chances of having their applications granted in different states. And this leads to what we call the asylum lottery. So it basically forces people on the move to move further into Europe to try to find a state where they're more likely to be granted international protection. And these statistics here are particularly interesting for the situation of Afghanistan. As Fivos touched in, Afghanistan has kind of been in this limbo country of origin position, where it's neither a safe country of origin, but also in many places is not deemed as a refugee producing country. And this kind of leads Afghans to being very much subject to this asylum lottery procedure. So these statistics that you can see here is the numbers of first instance positive decisions granted to Afghans in different states in 2019. So you can see it ranges as 98.3% in Italy, all the way to 4.1% in Bulgaria, with all of these variations in between. And so what this does is it creates pull factors for Afghans that force them to move irregularly through Europe to stand a better chance of being granted protection, and proliferates this idea of the asylum lottery. And I'll come on to the risks of that later when I look at the EU's informal asylum regime at European borders. So the foregrounding of safe countries of origin in 2015 did see many deportations to origin countries, but alongside this, large groups of people remained stuck in detention centres in lieu of removal, whilst formal deportation agreements had not yet been established. And this is something that we see very regularly in Greece with the increased use of pre-removal detention centres, people waiting for return to countries of origin in a protracted situation of legal uncertainty. It is despite this reality that has come from the 2015 crisis, it seems that the lesson has not been learned when we turn to the EU's response to what's happening now. And although the focus is not on safe country of origin practices, it's switched to safe third country practices. So we're remaining in this area of safe country practices and how those play out in EU policies. So with safe third countries, as I said, and as Fivos mentioned, Afghanistan has consistently been among the largest group of beneficiaries of international protection when analysed by country of origin. So these are the statistics from 2020, but actually for the last 3-4 years, they've been in second or third place in terms of how many people are being granted asylum from Afghanistan in the EU. And obviously with the current events with the Taliban, it's not exactly going to get any easier for the EU to accelerate procedures or dole out rejections and return Afghans in Europe to their country of origin. So this time what we've seen is the EU following a well-forged trend of externalization policies in which responsibility is outsourced to third states. I will mostly talk about Turkey now, but many of the scenes that have played out in the media obviously refer to Libya and the so-called Libyan coast guards, and the returns of vessels attempting to cross into Italy to Libya as a safe country, and obviously the fact that these are not safe places for these people to be returned to. And this is again the case with Turkey. Just 2 months ago, Greece released new legislation that deemed Turkey as a safe third country for all Afghans across Greece, which means that based on admissibility procedures, it is increasingly difficult, near impossible for them to enter the asylum system and lodge an application for international protection in Greece. And to better understand this, we have to turn back again to the 2015 crisis, where the EU-Turkey deal originally had its roots. So the EU-Turkey deal originally in 2016 was in relation to Syrians, but now IOM have shown that Afghans have now replaced Syrians as the top nationality seeking protection in Europe. And so we see now a shift towards Afghans given this current circumstances. So in the original deal in 2016, the EU pledged to support Turkey in strengthening its capacity to combat smuggling by reinforcing the Turkish Coast Guard patrolling and surveillance capacity. It's very important to note that often when the EU refers to smuggling, what they refer to is irregular migration, which of course is on the rise as formal routes of entry into Europe are increasingly being closed, walls are being built, border fences erected. And so smuggling becomes the only option for many people, and irregular migration becomes the only option. So a lot of when the EU policy documents refer to smuggling, what they're really referring to is irregular migration, something that most people don't have a choice not to engage in. The EU also pledged cooperation between EU member states and Turkey in organising joint return operations towards countries of origin of irregular migrants, playing into the safe country of origin concept again. And Turkey, in its turn, agreed to accelerate procedures to smoothly readmit irregular migrants not in need of international protection, intercepted coming from the Turkish territory, in line with bilateral readmission agreements. And in fact, all new irregular migrants crossing to the Greek islands were pledged to be returned directly to Turkey. There was an intensification of cooperation with Frontex, and the EU deployed a Frontex liaison officer to Turkey. So this was the original response of the Syrian crisis in 2015. And over the years, we've seen these commitments fall through, but what we haven't seen is the EU change its approach to Turkey. We've seen that Turkey actually refuses to take back many people who are rejected based on admissibility in Greece, and those are left in situations of protracted legal uncertainty, social exclusion, destitution, homelessness, and prolonged detention in Greece. Furthermore, as Fivos briefly touched upon, the events at the Evros border in 2020, when Erdogan opened the gates to Europe and bussed thousands of people on the move to the border, which played out in these very dramatic scenes of tear gas, rubber bullets, and unfortunately ended in death for 2 individuals, was a real testament to the fact that this deal is not working, Turkey is not playing up to its part, and it's a broken system. And yet the EU continues to pledge its support to this agreement. So in September 2021, earlier this month, the Commission released the draft action plan responding to events in Afghanistan. And again, what we saw was this commitment to the externalization policies of the EU. So in different areas, first of all, we saw what the Commission pledged was a commitment to strengthening cooperation with and support to countries along the migration route from Afghanistan to the EU, with a view to preventing irregular movement. And this came in the form of strengthening programs on capacity building, notably on integrated border management, on supporting protection systems, and on preventing the smuggling of migrants. So again, this push to externalize the attempt to stop movement right in the country of origin and its neighboring areas. And it specifically mentions in this document Turkey, Iran, and Pakistan as beneficiaries of financial and technical support from the EU to try to stop further movement from Afghanistan. This also has taken form in continued dialogue with Turkey under the EU-Turkey statement, despite the realities of that statement as I laid out before. So what this has meant is that the Commission has pledged a further 3 billion euros until 2024 to Turkey, on top of 6 billion already contracted and 535 million that was committed in 2021. Furthermore, Iran and Pakistan will benefit from 255 million euros through the multi-annual financial framework of the EU. And this is said that it will include community development and access to basic services, but as well, border management, policy support, and the fight against smuggling again. And on top of this, perhaps most shockingly, is that the EU has pledged 1.4 billion euros to Afghanistan to address the root cause of migration, with a focus on peace, stability, and democracy. The Commission has put in a caveat saying that this is supposedly dependent on the Taliban's commitment to upholding human rights, gender equality, and transparent and accountable governance. But of course, in the first weeks, these are not commitments that we have seen upheld, and we have not seen discussions on the part of the EU in terms of retracting this promise of funding. Now we will zoom in a bit to Turkey as a safe third country for Afghans. So as I said before, Turkey is now a safe third country for Afghans. So those who do manage to make it past Pakistan, past Iran, to Turkey, across the border, which Fivos has already developed the highly militarized aspect of that area, how dangerous it is. Those who make it into Greece will then be considered as having supposed to have lodged their claims in Turkey. So what we should look at is if Turkey really is a safe third country for Afghans. So in 2020, Afghanistan was the top nationality of persons apprehended for irregular migration, according to the ADA report, and this was 50,000, more than 50,000 out of 122,000 irregular arrivals that were recorded. And these people in Afghanistan, in Turkey from Afghanistan, are looking at restrictive measures, arbitrary detention, and deportation practices. And it's mostly single Afghan men who are being issued deportation forms, normally after administrative detention. And in Turkey, once you've been issued these deportation forms, you cannot then lodge an application for international protection until you've gone through the process of a judiciary review, which, as you can imagine, is time-consuming, costly, and not available to many people. Generally, in the past, deportations to Iran or Afghanistan have been generally considered safe by Turkey. And there was actually a case in 2020 before the first administrative court of Izmir, where the judge assessed Afghanistan to be a safe country and the applicant's appeal to suspend their deportation was not granted. So this person was directly returned to Afghanistan and it was seen as a safe country for them. And this has generally been a rule in Turkey, is that Iran and Afghanistan are seen as safe countries or safe third countries. Although, of course, Turkey doesn't subscribe to the Common European Asylum System, so they don't use the same terminology. Furthermore, an expert opinion from Proasil in 2020 concluded that Afghans had not been receiving adequate protection in Turkey for many years, with the issues of deportation that I mentioned, and also the issues of voluntary returns. Many of human rights activists and larger bodies in the region believe that Afghans are being forced to sign voluntary return papers to return to their country of origin whilst in detention in Turkey. And furthermore, in detention, there have been grave issues, lack of interpreters, communication, privacy between client and lawyer, and a lack of legal documents translated into Dari or Pashto languages. So this is the kind of safe third country that Afghans are facing when being rejected based on admissibility, if they even manage to enter the EU via Greece. And in spite of all of this, in spite of all the obstacles that the EU has put in place for individuals to reach the EU in the first place, there are, of course, people who will make the EU. And it is inevitable that some people will enter the European Union informally and seek protection in EU member states. So we have to look at what happens to them. And this is where the work of the Border Violence Monitoring Network comes in, which is a coalition of grassroots NGOs that acts horizontally to record incidences of pushbacks and other human rights violations at and within European borders. And these are some statistics gathered from the database of the BVMN work that has been going on since 2017 with multiple partner members across the region. So what BVMN posits and what has become increasingly clear is that there is a central hidden tenet to the EU asylum regime, and that is the practice of pushbacks. After the closure of the humanitarian corridor in 2016 and the erecting of border fences and walls, what we saw was a proliferation of the pushback practice that has only become more systematic and more prevalent in the following years. So a pushback is when somebody is forced back across a border without an individual assessment of their case. These are often highly violent events, and in many cases constitute a violation of the right to freedom from torture or inhumane and degrading treatment. So in terms of the BVMN statistics, BVMN has so far recorded 481 pushback cases involving Afghans across Balkan migratory routes since January 2017. And these incidents make up for 41% of all testimonies recorded by the network. So this is almost half of all testimonies recorded before the current situation began unfolding in Afghanistan. So we can only imagine how much worse it will become. Over 11,300 persons were involved in these pushbacks, but it's important to note that the exact number of Afghans is not discernible via the data, because interviews with members of transit group don't provide hard demographic breakdowns of the group composition. What the statistics do, however, highlight is the prevalence of violence involving Afghans who were targeted in pushback practices, who were subject to a range of brutal physical violence, on many counts amounting to torture. And here you can see a breakdown with beating, kicking, theft of personal belongings, being forced to undress, all the way down to incidences of sexual assault carried out by border guards and border authorities. This practice of pushbacks is another practice, another policy that the EU has externalized and contracted out to other countries. And so what I will now briefly talk about is pushbacks taking place from Turkey into Iran, and this kind of externalized responsibility and exported EU policy that takes place on the informal level as well as the formal level. So whilst the European Commission has been very vocal in criticizing anti-terror measures in eastern Turkey for leading to human rights violations, the Commission is active in financially supporting border surveillance in the region to prevent onward migration to EU soil. The EU's instrument for pre-accession assistance, called the IPA for Turkey, between 2014 and 2020, supplied Turkey with surveillance vehicles, communication and surveillance masts, thermal cameras, and hardware and software equipment. And the IPA also financed the training of border patrols in risk analysis and risk management. Researcher Karolina Augustova has noted that further interviews with people on the move point to pushbacks from Turkey to Iran occurring since 2016, which times quite nicely with the genesis of the EU-Turkey deal in response to the Syrian crisis. And what seems to be happening now, as reported by people on the ground, is that forcing people over the border to Iran with reports of physical beating, destruction of possessions, has intensified alongside the recent ban to deport Afghans to their country. And this is backed up by a New York Times article that came out recently, which cited a single operation in July in which more than 1,400 Afghans were rounded up and pushed back by Turkish border guards, according to a statement from the office of the governor of Van, a small city on the Turkish-Iranian border. And so to conclude, unfortunately, what we're seeing in this situation is an externalization of responsibility, an outsourcing of responsibility, contracting out other states to do the dirty work of the EU, to get their hands dirty in preventing people with genuine need for international protection from ever meeting EU soil. And where this is not being done formally, it's being done informally through trainings that are proliferating the pushback practice further outside of EU territory. The EU's approach to the Afghanistan problem is to keep it as far away as possible, and even if it gets in, to continue to push it back. What we're seeing here is no lesson learned from the Syrian example of 2015. If anything, restrictions seem harsher and pushbacks more violent. The new Pact on Migration, which came out in October 2020, unfortunately offers us little hope. The call for an independent border monitoring mechanism has boiled down to calling on member states who have been violating human rights in the form of pushbacks since 2016 to monitor and report on themselves. This will not be truly independent, and this will not be a solution. And just as Syria wasn't the last time the EU was faced with such an issue, neither will be Afghanistan. Thank you very much.
Wow. Thank you so much, Hope, for that. That was quite a set of presentations, and that was just fascinating and heartbreaking. You know, we have, we can take questions. I see a hand. Belinda has a question, so I am going to just allow her to talk.
Thanks so much, Sadia. Thank you for these really brilliant presentations and horrifying presentations. I'm really excited about the emphasis in the panel on activism as well as scholarship and knowledge. And I'm wondering, beyond the activism of the groups that Prevalence and Hope are part of, for example, in making people aware of these issues, then what do you think people can do more broadly than to respond and insist on among authorities, both within the EU and more broadly?
Who wants to take that? Fevos, go ahead. Yeah, and then Hope as well. Yeah.
So thanks for the question, Belinda, and thanks also, Hope, for the presentation. I'd like to start using two phrases that Shah Mahmood mentioned that I find very relevant to the question. You know, there is this notion of the knowledge about Afghanistan being used again against its people. I would say that when it comes to Greece, for example, and I think that also transcends to the EU and the US community, sometimes it's the non-knowledge that actually harms the people. And the second thing, when it comes to the experimentation that Shah Mahmood mentioned, is we see an experimentation in Afghanistan, but we also see an experimentation here. And I think that this is something that people have, even in a very selfish and egotistic way, have to acknowledge and fight against. Because if we know one thing from global history, I think we can agree that policies are going to implement it in a, you know, this experimentation in, as Shah Mahmood very well put it, judicial, military, and political. These are going to be replicated, and you know, again, it's not a very deep thought from my side, but one of the things that I'm trying to convey to people that are anti-refugee in Greece is that you have to understand that these policies are not going to stop there. They're not going to experiment only to the people coming. They're going to experiment to you, and they are experimenting on you. And I mean, very, very briefly to say that now with the new multi-purpose centers, we are going to see the use of biometrics, and the Greek police is introducing this year for its own very citizens, the esteemed Greek citizens, face recognition. So I think that one of the first responses to that is for people to actually acknowledge that this experimentation exists, and it's never confined between borders. Like, it's not built to be confined between borders, and it doesn't make profit if it's confined within borders.
Any hope, Shah Mahmood, anything?
I think it's always quite difficult when people ask, you know, like, what can we do? Because the situation is quite disheartening. I think the kind of approach I always take is that it feels often like nothing, but sharing knowledge is very important. I think that the people at the top, the stakeholders in the EU, they know what's happening and they're not doing anything about it. So top-down change is not going to happen, and that's something that we have to accept, which means all that we're left with to hope for is bottom-up change. And for that to happen, we need to share our knowledge and work together in order to push the people at the top to make the changes that are necessary.
Shah Mahmood, do you have anything to say on that, or?
Oh, well, I appreciate the spirit of the question, and I want to thank both Hope and Favos for really opening my eyes to these structures that are really just so saddening to reckon with. I spend a lot of time thinking about the circumstances of Afghans in Afghanistan, and not enough about the challenges faced in these contexts getting to the EU. So to answer the question, shifting it from the EU to the United States, you know, Favos said it so well, is that what happened in Afghanistan does not stay in Afghanistan. And the biometrics and other kinds of surveillance mechanisms are certainly coming home to roost. And I think to heighten consciousness of the coercive dimension of these structures of migration in the EU, as well as the coercion within Afghanistan, drones, sort of really emphasizing at the grassroots level the horror of militarized drones, and the nightmare of swarms of militarized drones being worked by artificial intelligence, really now being determinant for foreign policy and domestic kind of control. That kind of nexus between military technologies and policing technologies in the United States might be where you know, the activism, and both within the academy and outside of the academy, could be concentrated. So thank you for the question.
You know, I'm going to also say something else, which I think has, you know, and I think that this has always been eye-opening for me as well, and heartbreaking. You know, I've been seeing some of this in Greece, and of course, for those of us who work on colonial and imperial history, and on the current conflicts as well, sort of a certain kind of helpless pain is, you know, of watching is par for the course. But I also want to say that one of the things that's happened around the Afghanistan right now, you know, how do we respond to Afghanistan question in the academy? So a lot of it is about how can we get our students to do refugee activism, you know, work with the refugees, or how can we raise money and all that, which is great. We need that. But I think one of the things that we as scholars can also do, simply because we're hosting this at a university, right, is to actually have more knowledge about Afghanistan, and good knowledge, right? So not the kind of knowledge that is used against the Afghan people, but do not just see Afghans as abject recipients of violence or as violent perpetrators, right? But also as producers of knowledge and beauty, right? So, and to actually see a history, these counter histories that we need, and which we have pitifully little of, right? what's happened is, and Syam Mahmood and I were talking about this the other day, is that there's a kind of security discourse, and then there's a scholarly discourse that is only framed by responding to the security discourse, even if it's a critical, right? But there's nothing else, right? Those are the two things that we get. And part of it is that as members of the academy, we can also try to reframe the conversations, right? I'm going to push against that. So, I mean, I think that's very important, right? Which is why I was so eager to have Syam Mahmood speak, because, you know, you're talking about the environment, but you're also talking about animals. You're talking about the cameras. You have knowledge of 16th century history in that region, right? Which is not just colonial knowledge. There are other forms of knowledge, right? And we need to have those conversations, I think, in the academy as well, right? Because there is a kind of cross-fertilization. And if FIVOS has taught me anything in the past 5 years, it's that a kind of productive and respectful engagement with activists means us also doing our job as scholars, that we don't pretend to be what we're not, that what we bring to the table is precisely our capacity to do research. And that, you know, so FIVOS will say to me, I need something right now, right? Or I'll say to FIVOS, I need this from you, right? But it's a symbiotic but mutually respectful one where we need each other at some level, I think. I mean, but that's also my politics. But I think we don't become better contributors by not doing what we know how to do, which is research. Right, we need to do the work also. Yeah, I'm with you. We're going to say something.
Well, I'm just so interested in the vastness of the systems that Hope and FIVOS just described, and I wonder if in their work they find any Afghan members of, you know, the border violence NGOs. Is there any personnel, Afghan personnel, in the international humanitarian work on Afghanistan that could, you know, personify sort of a bridge between local and international knowledge? You know, we see Afghan Americans in the U.S. military being celebrated for translation services and cultural, you know, kind of genetic cultural translation or something. And I wonder if there's any kind of comparable Afghan presence in European, you know, kind of activist circles.
I think for sure, like there's definitely two kind of planes on which this happened. There are these larger EU organizations, almost businesses, you might say, like the International Organization of Migration, IOM, and the UNHCR, where you have Afghans being brought in as interpreters. But a lot of the conversations that I have with those people are, again, similar to the conversations you have with people who have interpreted for the US Army in Afghanistan, a feeling of exploitation and lack of safeness. And I think that there's another level on which engagement can take place, which is something that we foreground in the project that I run as a grassroots direct aid project on the ground in Thessaloniki, as we try to include community members as members of the team. So we try to have a team that is balanced between international volunteers, community members, and local Greek volunteers, so that a kind of like co-production of knowledge can be created in that space, so that the mechanisms that we work through, I mean, we're providing very basic things like food and hygiene items, but we are doing it in a way that fits to the local context, the context of the population that we serve, and the kind of international larger organizations and their historical learning mechanisms. And I think this is not something that's so uncommon, especially in the context of Greece. People who are more loosely, horizontally self-organized in squats have traditionally brought in members of the community into the way that they're running as a way of re-empowering and giving back the voice.
Thank you.
And I could just add to that when it comes, and I mean, I've seen that, you know, one of the main questions that I personally had to deal with was, you know, coming back from London and choosing not to use my experience as someone that is from Greece, has been part of, let's say, the response to the refugee crisis, that chooses to stay in London to write, as he would still continue to be part of this movement, right? Like, I chose not to do this. And I think that what was really eye-opening being in Greece and engaging mainly with Greek researchers, because that's the nature of the team I'm working on, not by choice necessarily, like it just happened to be, was when we actually started speaking with people that are from Syria, from Pakistan, from Afghanistan, and are part of the refugee community here. And instead of asking them for legitimization, basically asking them for their own knowledge and skills on this. Like we had people that have given us testimonies, and the more we actually started asking them specific questions, treating them equally when it comes to the knowledge that they bear as somebody that actually was there when these things happening, this actually provided us with way more information. And again, tying that back to the different contexts that are not that far away from each other, you will see that people will recognize, even in my line of work, which is to collect and analyze testimonies, you will see that they will very easily pick up common practices between the police and the army in Afghanistan, in Turkey, and subsequently in Greece. And if you deny this agency of knowledge that comes with this experience, then I think we can also not do our work correctly. Like it's taking away, apart from the ethical side of things, it also takes away from the practical aspect of producing quality research, of producing quality analysis, and to, let's say, forensically, but in a counter forensic way, produce knowledge that is so much needed for this line of work.
Do people have questions? Belinda has a follow-up, but I thought we'd take a couple, and then if other people have questions as well. People are being very restrained and polite, but I thought if you do, please either type them into the chat or Q&A, and I will read them. Belinda has a follow-up one, which is, what should we demand, or what should be done beyond protest against current policy? But I also want to ask a different question, or I want to, which comes out of a sort of observation, right? So the gender question is often raised, and it's a very important one, but it gets reduced, I think, in scholarly terms, just to a critique of wanting to critique, the tendency to want to save Muslim women from brown men, right? What I find as I think a kind of very important corollary, right, which doesn't get enough attention, it seems to me, is the way in which young men, migrant men, are gendered, right? And how they are produced. Because what I've seen, right, in Lesbos, and what I've seen in the refugee situation, is that these are very young, they're young boys, right? They're young, right? So there's a kind of way in which, their vulnerability is invisible, right? Which is a corollary of the discourse of the Muslim male being, this kind of creature from which the Muslim woman has to be saved, right? And which is not at all to in any way take away from the patriarchal structures that, I'm committed to fighting in my life, right? And in the world, right? But that doesn't change the fact that part of what that patriarchy produces is incredibly vulnerable young men as well, right? And so I'd like to hear more from Fiwas and Hope as well about this, right? And the way that these men get exploited. So one of the things that I wrote about in that piece that came out of the Moria event was a story that Ari Ricker, who also does advocacy work in Greece, or was doing it, I don't know if she's still there, told me where young women would come, volunteers would come from the rest of Europe, fall in love with young, or have sex with these young men who would fall in love with them and then promise them home and then abandon them. Right, so imagine doing that to a young refugee male who's got who's come without his family, who's incredibly vulnerable and has a very different cultural code, right? And gets attached and then is abandoned, right? So it becomes part of a structure of volunteerism, the word that was being thrown around. But that's one. Then there's the other question of can a young man be a minor? Right? How is that working, and how is gender working and denying the minority as such in terms of independence of young men, right? So women become, again, the good refugees, right? Men are the bad refugees. Now, which again, not to in any way play down the violence that is also happening against women, both within on the migration route, and then also as violence from Frontex, right? But which, as far as I can tell, is also directed towards young men. So could you talk a little bit about the gender issue? And then you know, also Belinda's question about what can be done beyond protest?
You've probably seen me vigorously nodding along because this is a topic I have a lot to say about. The project that I am working with was basically created because there was a huge service gap and there was absolutely nobody helping the young men, and they were completely demonized. And when you look at this situation, you see young men of color entering Europe, and the way they are perceived is immediately dangerous, immediately predatory, immediately thieves and drug addicts. And this is the prevalent image of these individuals. And for 3 years, this is the group that I've been working with, are the young men. And what you see is that because they're left out of services, because there's nowhere else for them to go, and because it's so much harder, they're then pushed into these systems of drug dealing, of drug abuse, which then perpetuate themselves. And it becomes this vicious circle where they're forced into this identity. And then the identity reinforces the stereotype, which forces them further down that path. And this is really one of the saddest things. And of course, you know, it's not at all to downplay the situation of women and the amazing work that women's centers are doing in the city of Thessaloniki and in Greece, and doing these amazing community projects with women. And this is so important, but there is this just massive forgotten group of these young men that are seen as the least empathetic figures. And what you were saying about like this volunteerism and women coming across, and this for me is always a very important point in all introductions I give to volunteers, is that in this space, the gender dynamic is no longer at play, because the people we serve are 99% male, and they are the ones who are in a position of lower power than you. You are the one who decides what they eat. You are the one who gives them their food, who gives them their clothes, who basically is in charge of every single aspect of what they look like. You are the person coming across from Western Europe with your passport. And therefore this dynamic is very difficult. And I think if you had a situation where you had male volunteers sleeping with young female refugees who were seeking assistance in camps, there would be absolute outcry, like there was with the Haiti scandal. But when it comes to women sleeping with men, because of this like more foregrounded patriarchal dynamic, there's a difficulty to detach from that in the space where the power imbalance becomes different. And I think this is really, really important to acknowledge. And the gender question definitely becomes highly complex and also highly interesting when you're looking at the position of single young men in Europe. And the majority of people on the move who are being subject to these brutal border regimes are the single young men.
Two quick notes from my side on that. So on the note of the gender aspect, I'd just like to say that it's also being used very largely by the alt-right and the far-right movements in Europe right now and in Greece. So it's not only liberating Muslim women, but also tell them how they should be liberated by being in Europe. We've seen that as part of the online cultures, of the alt-right, where many times, people are going to protest about women's clothing, but they will not protest about, let's say, nuns in Greek monasteries. And also, I mean, from my own positionality, like being in Greece and having been raised in Greece, it feels a very weird conversation to be part of when these things come up, knowing that we indeed have very fundamental Christian aspects of our society. The next thing that I would also like to tie a bit with the Greek traditions and the way, let's say, of families and the ways of living here, is that for a culture that advocates throughout the centuries and in its existence, a willingness, let's say, for the young adult to remain a child as much as possible, and this has been like this is an integral part of a Greek family and has been. We are very harsh as a society when it comes to young adults or even minors. I mean, legally minors that have a refugee profile. And one very practical example of that is that recently Greece unrolled a program where from the age of 16, young refugees are going to be able to work and are encouraged to work in the tourism industry. And I can just like I'm trying to think what would the reaction be for Greek families, from Greek families, if young Greeks were to stop school, not attend school for 2 years, and or even work their summers in a hotel in the conditions that are not necessarily the best ones. So I think it's also a question of age that Sadia brought up to this, and I think it's very, very much to the point. In general, this catch-22, let's say, of who is vulnerable and what constitutes somebody vulnerable, comes very much into play when EU policies are being drafted, and they usually left out the people that end up being the most vulnerable because of these policies.
Questions? Do you guys want to ask each other any questions? Okay, so we have one in the chat from Soily. Perhaps we could, Soily, do you want to just read it? Come on, let me allow you to talk. And you, of course, know Phoebus, so I'm sure he'll be delighted to hear from him.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Sorry, I've gotten several messages about my internet being unstable, but I was really struck by some of the photos that Fivos had provided. And I'm always struck by this with the border and militarization, but it's such a performance on some level, because obviously these war boats are far more, they're out equipped for the people they're confronting. Like, nobody showing up has anything to combat such a thing. So it feels like an overreaction, and of course they're doing actual violence, and then also when you're confronting people fleeing militarized areas, especially a place like Afghanistan that's had the US military there for so long, what is being performed here? And I have my own research on refuge, so I'm thinking a little bit about that. But what is being performed here? Why and for whom? Because it's being performed to the tune of billions of dollars. So what is this performance, and who is it for?
Who wants to go?
I can try. I can give an attempt. So I think there's two things that we are touching upon here, and please do correct me. The one is the performativity of the actual thing, like the patrol boat, and the other one is the image of the patrol boat. I think we can split it into these two. And obviously, when we speak about images, it always comes, frames of war. Abu Ghraib comes into mind, and the performativity of images such as the image of Aylan Kurdi, which influenced indeed many people to come on the field. I think that they both serve what the EU and Greece, and I think the global policymakers are calling deterrence. Like, there's a very practical aspect. There is indeed people, regardless of how desperate they might be, that will feel deterred or will try, not that they will not try to cross. Like, this has never been achieved in the history of humankind. They will try to choose another way. Maybe a more manageable way, a more controllable way, but they will definitely try to cross, regardless of what they see in front of them. And I think that it also seeks to appeal to the construction of what Gaddafi would call the barbarians. Like, we have to act like we are facing an invasion. And in order to have an invasion, we need an organized army. And in order to need, to have an organized army, they need weapons, and they need to have a cause, and they have a motive, and they need to come and fight us. So we have to respond. And this preparation of the fences, the multi-purpose centers, which I personally call prisons, and many others do, serves the purpose of proving to the very people of Greece and to the citizens of the EU, and to appeal their nationalist and sovereign tendencies of saying we have to be against this, because if I need a super armed and very well designed boat to combat these people, then these people must be bad, and they must come here equipped in order to do that. So I think this has a very practical appeal to people that are going to vote for said legislators to continue making these policies. Like, it comes to, and also money, like 3.5 billions to Greece, 6 billions to Turkey. Like, it's a very worthy And also, to just one small, speaking of the experimentation and the testing grounds in the very military and surveillance side of it, Greece is now testing technologies from Israel. Like Greece recently signed one of its, I think, the biggest contract with Elbit, which is a military industrial complex company in Israel. Like these companies need testing grounds. They need to find a way to test these systems, and they need to acquire data. And also, like a small heads up, shout out to Belinda's follow up. I think this is also another field that is very fruitful for resistance, and this is the acquisition of data. And this is also like, how can we disrupt in legal ways, I'd say for now, and how we can sabotage legally and boycott legally these practices that we see on our everyday life, and how they're being instrumentalized then onwards towards the Middle East or theaters of war that the EU and US construct.
Do we have any other questions? Yes, we have a question on Syria. So Alexander Davis has a set of interrelated questions. When it comes to knowledge about how EU policy is affecting refugees, and what are good networks one could link into or follow, and to what extent do these groups have their own media ecosystems? Do different organizations talk to each other, and how well are they able to broadcast their position to external, quote, mainstream groups, example from, say, an NGO to the NY Times or Süddeutsche Zeitung? And my German pronunciation is atrocious. Sorry, Alexander, I didn't elevate you to talk, simply because we're accumulating these little visuals here, and I'm worried about the recording that has to be downloaded and put up on various sites. So I'm not, there's no hierarchy. I just realized that there's a problem with the view. Guys, the question? And you can read it on Q&A as well if you need to. So, what good networks?
Well, of course, I would start by saying the Border Violence Monitoring Network. It's a great one to follow. But really, this is 15 different organizations from across the EU. So you've got Greece, Turkey, Serbia, Bosnia, Croatia, Italy, Germany. I'm missing many. So this is a really good place to follow. And there's kind of this, there's different working groups that share different types of knowledge, that work on different types of things. So different media outputs, different creative things, working on a film, working on policy papers. So this is a kind of place where you can access all different ways of relating. That's borderviolence.eu. But also, I think, like, in terms of getting things out to the mainstream media, it's always something that is a struggle, because obviously naturally these stories, they're constant, they're every day, and the journalists have to find a way to keep their readership and to bring in the interest. And obviously journalists are fleeting figures who come through for a day or two and need the best story, and this specific, I need an unaccompanied minor from Afghanistan who just crossed from Turkey. And obviously this is a really difficult dynamic, and it is a really difficult play, because you need the stories to get out there, but you need to do it in a way that is protecting the people, and protecting the people whose stories they are, and in a way that's not just, you know, taking them out of somebody's mouth, but really trying to recenter their voice. So I think there are lots of very interesting. Another thing I would say is Are You Serious? Make a daily digest of different things going on in Europe. So there's a number of different places. I'll type them in the chat. Fivos probably has more too.
I would like to stay a bit on the media side of things, not so much of the organizations, because I think that, and I mean that's why I'm supporting very gladly the work of Border Violence Monitoring Network, and this Info Collective that I work with is part of it. I really think that it was a very needed network, and it needs to be expanded, and it will get expanded, you know, regardless of even whether we want it or not. What I wanted to say though about the media side is, I think what is missing, and I, you know, being self-conscious here as well, is that people try sometimes to focus on the presentations and the media reports by New York Times and The Guardian in the UK is Deutsche Zeitung, and, you know, Liberation and big newspapers. And I think people should do that. But I think that there are networks and there are writers that have a very big experience on these issues, reporting them for years, and we just don't happen to know them. And that goes for me and Hope as well, that are dealing with this every day, just because we don't happen to language or we don't happen to know the media. One great example is the Balkan Investigative Reporters Network, BIRN, which does amazing work, published in English as well. And I think that if somebody really wants to learn about a specific aspect of this or a specific country, that a border, sometimes it's worth going into, I don't know, even blog posts of people that consecutively do that for like since 2010, 2009, even as hobbyists, one would say. But they provide actual insights, and because they have everything to lose them, because they are there, they are part of the community that they are reporting about. And I don't mean necessarily the refugee community, I mean the local community on this very small village somewhere up in the north of Serbia. I don't know. This sometimes leads up to very, very nice reporting and very informative pieces.
There's a question here, and then I'm going to follow up with one too, and then we'll start wrapping up because it's 2:48. There seems to be a parallel between the demonization of young Afghans in Europe to challenges faced by Black boys and men here, as an article by Brookings notes, its specific brand of racism at the sharp intersection of race and gender. I mean, I would include that not just to Afghan men, but Muslim men, but I don't know if you guys feel comfortable speaking to any of that.
I mean, I think again, it's what I mentioned earlier. It's this construction of the brown man or the black man as immediately that, I mean, obviously in the US, we've seen all of these things playing out, you know, from Flags of a Nation onwards and how that's developed into US policy. And I think it's the same thing with Muslim men and brown men in Europe, and this intersection of race and gender, which is why obviously Kimberly Crenshaw's work is so seminal and so important, is that we have to look at where these things are intersecting. And when you have a person on the move in Europe, I mean, you have statelessness, you have lack of documentation, you have homelessness, you have instability, you have race, and you have gender. And all of those things are really playing together to create this immediately dangerous person, that then it's so much harder to get past that first instant. And I think it's very similar to what happens with young Black men in the US. It's also just a tactic of policing that plays out.
I mean, it is worth keeping in mind that some of the stuff that is happening, that happened in Bagram, but also other places, I mean, we now know that some of those policing tactics were first practiced in the United States. This is now well documented, right? And we do know that, you know, there's actually a seepage between who actually does it, right? Because there's also a pipeline of workers, and I mean now security workers, right? And they're not just in private companies, but also they come from back and forth across the army, the police, and these private companies. So I think that's and that was what Shah Mahmood was talking about. So to bring it all together, I think, you know, then, and to return to the colonial question in some ways, right? I mean, I think that part of what's come out so brilliantly today in some ways, right? And you know, I hesitate to celebrate the panel because what you're talking, because I don't want to redeem in any way the subject, right? I mean, this isn't, so I don't want to feel, you know, we don't want to kind of feel smug about having been able, I don't want to feel smug about having put together what I think is actually an astonishingly effective conversation, because at the same time, what we're talking about is so awful, right? And so irredeemable and shouldn't be happening. But I have learned a lot, and I think our audiences too. But one of the things that comes across, of course, is that is again a paradox of mobility that I've become increasingly interested in, right? To come back to what Shah Mahmood was saying as well, right? That there's a little road where everybody's upset because the Taliban won't allow people to take the road. And, you know, and again, I say this not to redeem the Taliban. I don't think they can be, but at the same time, one of the things that we've seen since the inception of modern colonialism, right, is is the hypermobility of some and the arrested mobility of others, right? And remember that that's fundamental to the modern formation, in fact. And so, and that goes even with the development of Ara Judy has written, right? That, for instance, one of the forces of American power is, sort of perpetual change, right? And at the same time, the preemption of change elsewhere, right? And that speaks to the question of mobility as well. What's interesting then about this is, right, to take us back to Shah Mahmood's presentation, where I think we'll end unless somebody really has a pressing question, is with this question to you, Shah Mahmood, is that, so I'm reading Elphinstone and I'm reading Frere, who then writes a piece about Afghanistan and South Africa, because so much of, partly what has happened to Afghanistan also has to do with the fact that the Afghans actually defeated the British, right? Which is also part of their fate. I think that they're part of the reason that they become these objects of further experimentation. It's not just that it's a buffer, but because it's they defeat the English, right? And of course, that's what happens with the Zulu battle, even though the British eventually win, and Frere gets called on that. And again, to keep in mind that Frere was also the governor of Sindh, and I was actually in something called Frere House at my Presbyterian school in post-colonial Pakistan. I was a prefect in Frere House. This is the colonial history, and it's been coming back to me forever because I'd forgotten this, right? And the Scottish element is so important because, of course, Walter Scott's notion of clans and a kind of idealized, customary production of the Scottish Highlander post 1707 and the Act of Unification in Britain is what's informing the description of the Afghans in Elphinstone. You can see it. I mean, the kind of, or not so much in Elphinstone, but in subsequent, in Curzon at least, right? In subsequent work. So I want you to think a little bit more with us, Shah Mahmood, about the question of colonialism here. But I also want you to explain something that is recurrent in your work, but that I don't fully understand. There's a lot at stake in your work, and you said it today as well, in the production of the Pashtun, right, as a contradictory figure, right, who apparently represents the Afghan state, but then doesn't, but also represents the hinterland. You've said in another conversation. What's at stake in the construction of the Pashtun? Because you come back to it repeatedly. And in that construction of ethnicity for what we're seeing today. And I should also say, what tangible things can institutions of higher education do right now to assist the Afghan refugees? That's from Anu Gupta. And I think that's a particularly important question because Anu Gupta is with Rutgers Global. So that affects Rutgers policy very directly. and actually, the vice president of Rutgers Global is also in the audience, Eric Garfunkel. So you might actually be able to kind of help us think about what we can do. So 2 questions.
Well, I'll take the second first. And whether myself or anyone associated with the American Institute of Afghanistan Studies can kind of help navigate scholarly sponsoring, whether it's through, for a journalist or a scholar, I would just encourage Rutgers to reach out to the organizations, and I can help with this, supporting those kind of intellectuals and journalists who are trying to leave. And I say that somewhat reluctantly because, it's a complex decision to leave Afghanistan for whatever the reasons are. And to support people leaving is, on some level, it's not always comfortable, but that option is there. Now, for the first question about Pashtunness, I think the most important thing is not what it was it what's at stake is the non-Pashtuns, because by reducing Afghanistan to a purely Pashtun entity with good Pashtuns and bad Pashtuns, or urban or rural Pashtuns, or sort of the word deracinated has been used, deracinated Pashtuns in Kabul and then tribal Pashtuns in the that's just so limiting to the diversity of Afghanistan in the first instance. And it really misreads the actual practice of Pashtunness, because the, one thing that's really underplayed, and this is really the idea of Alessandro Mansuti, not mine, but friendship cuts across ethnicity in really complex ways. And this can lead in a lot of circumstances to marriage relations. And I'm from a Pashtun family from Afghanistan, and we have so many non-Pashtuns in our family, Uzbeks and others. And so Pashtunness really involves a lot of non-Pashtun elements, at least in terms of a kinship structure and a social history. So it's the limiting factor of centering Pashtunness and its varieties for Afghanistan that's at stake, I think. Sadia.
Thank you. Well, on that note, I'm going to stop the recording, and I want to say an official thank you, and then of course we can continue if people want to ask, chat a little afterwards. But I want to thank all three of our panelists for what I thought was a remarkable panel. I learned a lot, and I'm hoping that all three of you will come back, and I will make sure to invite you. So I hope that, and maybe even in person, because that would be wonderful. Because you can't really do this without breaking bread together. Because I believe that in all of the cultures that I love, that is very important. And I also want to say that I think that this is it's only the first event that we're having on this. Because we're going to have a whole series in Afghanistan over the next year or two, and I personally am very committed to the dissemination of more knowledge around it and the production of helping produce knowledge, because I think that is what the university's duty, right? And when I say produce, I'm not saying I'm going to produce it, but I do want to get and encourage also young scholars to do the work and to provide the institution's resources to making that work visible and central. So thank you so much.